It began, as so many things do, with a whisper in the dark, a question murmured into the quiet space between two people who knew, with every fiber of their being, that they shouldn't be there at all. The rain outside lashed against the window pane of the professor's office, a fitting drumbeat for the chaotic rhythm of their hearts. His hand was a gentle fire on her waist, and she was a soft, trembling thing in his arms, her body molding to his as if it had always belonged there. "No, Professor," she breathed, the words a fragile plea against the storm inside them both. Her voice, usually so sharp with intellect and defiance in his class, was now nothing more than a ragged sigh. "We shouldn't. This is wrong." But even as the protest left her lips, her fingers were curling into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, demanding the very thing she was trying to deny. Julian Croft, a man whose life had become a predictable, book-lined hallway of routine and quiet desolation, simply held her tighter, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He tasted the faint sweetness of her perfume and the salt of her tears, and the long-forgotten ache of pure, unadulterated want surged through him. "Shh, Alara," he rasped, the sound a low, resonant rumble in his chest. "Just for a moment. Just let this be real." Her resistance was not a battle, but a surrender, a final, intoxicating sigh that turned to a soft moan as his lips found hers, consuming the air between them, the last vestiges of reason and professional decorum dissolving into the dim light of the single desk lamp. The girl, Alara Vance, was just 21 years old, a final-year English major with a scholarship that felt more like a shackle than a lifeline. She was bright, ambitious, and financially stretched, and the one thing standing between her and a secure future was a single failing grade in a course she never wanted to take: metaphysical poetry, taught by a man whose intellect was as sharp as his demeanor was distant. She had a long-distance boyfriend, Liam, a kind and steady presence who had been her anchor since high school, but who felt a world away from the intellectual and emotional chasm she was now navigating. The man, Professor Julian Croft, was a respected 40-something scholar whose world was confined to leather-bound books and the polite, passionless routine of a marriage to a successful art gallery owner, Isabel, who was often a continent away. His life was a silent testament to a desire he had long since buried. The setting was his office, a sanctuary of knowledge on an old New England campus, now tainted by the simple, desperate human need they had both brought into its quiet sanctity. This was not the culmination of a long, romantic courtship. This was the result of a single, simple request for extra credit, a final, desperate chance for a student to save her future, and for a professor to feel something real again. And in this stolen, forbidden moment, they had both found the price was far higher than either of them could have ever imagined. Alara Vance stood outside his office door, the brass plaque a cold and unyielding sentinel before her. "Professor Julian Croft," it read, in letters that seemed to mock the trembling in her hands. She had always been a master of performance, a girl who could wear a facade of effortless brilliance like a second skin, but beneath the surface, a low-grade hum of anxiety was now building into a deafening roar. Her scholarship was a fragile thing, built on a foundation of perfect grades, and metaphysical poetry, of all things, was proving to be the one crack in the perfectly constructed dam of her academic life. This was not about intellectual curiosity. This was about survival. The hallway was hushed, the last of the afternoon light fading through the tall windows, casting long, dramatic shadows. She straightened her simple, worn-in jeans and adjusted the collar of her thrift store sweater, a stark contrast to the impeccable, tweed-clad figure she was about to face. She took a single, deep breath, the cold autumn air burning in her lungs, and knocked. A low, distant voice bid her to enter. The moment the door swung open, she was no longer in the university hallway, but in another world entirely. It was a place of intellectual dust and quiet contemplation, a sanctuary of tall, overflowing bookshelves that bowed under the weight of centuries of thought. The air smelled of old paper and the lingering ghost of pipe tobacco, an aroma both foreign and strangely comforting. Julian Croft was seated behind a large, cluttered oak desk, a single green-shaded lamp casting a circle of warm light over a stack of papers. He didn't look up immediately, allowing her to stand there, a silent acknowledgement of his authority. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic tapping of his pen against a notebook. It was a calculated silence, a subtle test, and Alara, for all her preparation, felt the familiar confidence beginning to fray at the edges. "Alara Vance," he said at last, his voice a low, gravelly sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He finally lifted his gaze, and she met it, her chin held high, despite the sudden lurch in her stomach. His eyes were a startling blue, framed by faint lines of fatigue that spoke of too many late nights spent in the company of ghosts and poets. "You are here about your final paper, I presume." His tone was polite but entirely devoid of warmth, a perfect reflection of the cold, impersonal feedback he had given her on every assignment. She swallowed hard, the practiced words feeling dry on her tongue. "Yes, Professor Croft, I've been struggling with the material. I know my last few papers haven't been up to my usual standard, and I was hoping to discuss some options for extra credit." She tried to make it sound like a simple request, a reasonable inquiry from a dedicated student. He leaned back in his leather chair, the leather groaning in protest. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk, a worn-out thing that looked as if it had been a witness to countless academic struggles. "Sit." She did, her posture ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. He picked up her most recent paper, his fingers tracing the margin where his own meticulous, red-inked critiques were scrawled. "Your work, Miss Vance," he began, his voice taking on the detached rhythm of a clinical diagnosis, "lacks soul. You write with the precision of a mathematician, but poetry, especially the metaphysical kind, is not a problem to be solved. It's a wound to be felt. You understand the structure, the rhetoric, the historical context, but you do not feel the ache of it. You do not understand the desperate human need behind the words." He paused, looking at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Your paper is a textbook example of academic rigor without emotional connection. It is a hollow." His words were a direct hit, a confirmation of her worst fears. She felt the tears sting the back of her eyes, a sharp, humiliating wave of emotion. This was the raw truth she had been running from. She was so focused on the grade, on the survival, that she had lost the very thing that had drawn her to literature in the first place. "It's my scholarship, Professor," she blurted out, the pretense of intellectual discussion collapsing under the weight of her desperation. "If I don't get at least a B in this class, I could lose it. My family, they can't afford to pay for this." She said it not for pity, but because the truth was a desperate thing, and it was all she had left. The change in him was subtle, almost imperceptible. The professional, detached mask slipped just enough for a flicker of something else to surface. He set her paper down and leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped under his chin. He looked at her not as a student, but as a person. His gaze swept over her, taking in the faint circles under her eyes, the careful neatness of her simple clothes, the subtle tremble of her lower lip. He saw the fire that still burned beneath the facade of anxiety, the ambition that fueled her, and for the first time, he found himself truly looking at her, not her paper, but her. He noticed the way her hair caught the light, the soft curve of her lips, the genuine fear and determination in her eyes. It was a fleeting moment, a spark of recognition for a kindred spirit who was also trapped in a life she was trying desperately to build. He had his own cage, and she, he realized, was fighting for hers. "Extra credit is not a viable solution, Miss Vance," he said, his voice now lower, more a confidential whisper than a command. "A grade is not something you earn with busy work. It's a reflection of genuine understanding, and you are capable of understanding." He sat back, the faint scent of his cologne, something woody and melancholic, reaching across the desk. "I will not give you a grade you have not earned, but I can give you the tools to earn it." He looked her directly in the eye, and the unspoken weight of the moment was almost unbearable. "My office hours will not be enough. If you are serious about this, I will meet with you privately. After hours, we can go over the material in depth." He didn't smile, but a glint appeared in his eye, a hint of something she couldn't yet name, a sort of private tutelage. The words hung in the air, a loaded invitation. The simple request for a grade had become an offer of something far more complex and, in that quiet, dimly lit room, far more dangerous. Alara, her mind consumed by the fear of losing her scholarship, didn't hesitate. She was a woman in a desert, and he was offering a glass of water, no matter how murky its source might be. "Yes," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too quick. "Yes, Professor, thank you." She stood, clutching the worn-out paper, the ink-red marks on its surface no longer a mark of her failure, but a map to a future she was now both desperate and terrified to walk towards. He simply nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible turn of his lips. "I'll see you Monday night then. Don't be late." And as she stepped back into the sterile, quiet hallway, she felt a shiver, a cold premonition that had nothing to do with the autumn storm outside, but everything to do with the storm that had just begun to brew inside of her. The campus was a ghost of itself when she returned on Monday night. The familiar pathways were now dark, lonely arteries, the lifeblood of students and faculty having receded until the morning. Each click of her heels on the stone walkway felt like an announcement of her clandestine purpose. She clutched a worn copy of John Donne's poetry to her chest, the book a flimsy shield against the strange cocktail of dread and anticipation churning within her. The professor's office, a beacon of light in the otherwise dark and silent humanities building, felt less like a part of the university and more like a separate, secluded world. Julian was already there, the green lamp casting its familiar glow, the rain from the week before replaced by a crisp, clear night that seemed to hold its breath. He was not behind his desk this time, but in one of the worn armchairs, a book open in his lap, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up as she entered, and the professional distance she had seen before was still there, but it was softer around the edges, as if blurred by the late hour. "Miss Vance," he said, closing his book. "Punctual. I appreciate that." He gestured to the other armchair, and the simple change in seating, from across a desk to beside him, shifted the entire dynamic of the room. It was no longer an interrogation, but a conversation. He had a specific poem in mind, The Flea, a work of audacious wit and seduction. For the first hour, the session was exactly as he had promised, a rigorous, line-by-line deconstruction of the text. He was a masterful teacher, peeling back layers of meaning, exposing the intricate clockwork of the poet's mind. And Alara, free from the judgment of her peers and the looming threat of the red pen, found her own voice. She argued with him, challenged his interpretations, her own insights sharp and intuitive. He would counter, pushing her further, forcing her to defend her position not with memorized facts, but with genuine intellectual conviction. The air crackled with the energy of their debate, a purely academic fire that was nonetheless exhilarating. The shift happened subtly. They were bent over a single ancient anthology, the page illuminated by the warm light between them. Julian was tracing a line with his finger, explaining a complex theological conceit. "Don is using this imagery," he explained, "to collapse the sacred and the profane, to elevate a physical act into a spiritual union." He stopped, his finger hovering over the text. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "But forget the academic analysis for a moment. What do you feel, Alara, when you read that? This desperate, clever attempt to justify desire. Does it feel honest to you?" The use of her first name was a small, almost insignificant slip, but it landed between them with the weight of a stone. He had stripped away the formality, asking not what she thought, but what she felt. The question unlocked something within her. She looked down at the page, at the centuries-old words, and saw a mirror. "It feels frantic," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It feels like a man trying to convince himself as much as he's trying to convince the woman. He's building this beautiful, intricate argument because the simple truth of his desire isn't enough. He needs to make it noble, to make it right. Because maybe, deep down, he knows it isn't." She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time, she wasn't speaking as a student trying to find the right answer. She was speaking as a woman who understood the complex architecture of justification, the way the heart builds elaborate cathedrals to house its most forbidden secrets. Julian stared at her, the professor's mask completely gone, replaced by a look of profound, undisguised admiration. It was as if he were seeing her for the very first time. He saw the raw, vibrant soul he had accused her of lacking, and it was more brilliant than he could have imagined. A slow, sad smile touched his lips. "When I was your age," he said, his voice softer now, confessional. I believed that literature could save the world. I thought a single perfect line of poetry held more truth than all of philosophy. He looked away, towards the dark window. I suppose I still do. But the world has a way of sanding down your passions, of turning them into a profession. In that moment, he wasn't her professor. He was just a man, reflecting on the ghost of his younger, more idealistic self, a ghost he now saw sitting right in front of him. The conversation drifted from the poem, becoming a shared exploration of their own lives through the lens of literature. They spoke of love, of the compromises we make, of the quiet desperation that can settle into a life that looks perfect from the outside. He never asked about Liam directly, but he didn't have to. When they discussed the theme of settling, of choosing safety over passion in a novel they both admired, Alara's words were laced with a melancholy that told him everything he needed to know. She spoke of her boyfriend with affection, but it was the affection one has for a comfortable, familiar room, not for a fire that warms you to the bone. She felt a connection with Julian that was thrilling in its intensity. He didn't just hear her words, he understood the thoughts behind them. He finished her sentences, he challenged her assumptions, and, in doing so, validated her intelligence in a way no one ever had. Liam loved her, she knew, but he didn't know this part of her. He didn't understand the thrill she got from dissecting a metaphor or the deep, abiding comfort she found in the cadence of a line of verse. With Julian, she was not just a girlfriend or a student. She was a mind worthy of engagement, worthy of respect. As they leaned over the anthology again, their shoulders brushed, a fleeting spark of warmth. He pointed to another passage, and his hand covered hers on the page for a fraction of a second, a gesture so brief it could have been an accident, yet so deliberate it sent a jolt through her entire body. She pulled her hand back slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air in the room had changed. The intellectual fire had not been extinguished, it had simply found a new, more dangerous fuel. The clock on the wall chimed 10, and the sound broke the spell. 2 hours had vanished in what felt like minutes. "I should go," she said, her voice husky. He simply nodded, his eyes holding hers for a beat too long. "Until Wednesday, then." As she walked back through the sleeping campus, the cool night air did nothing to quell the heat in her cheeks. The guilt was there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was overshadowed by a brilliant, terrifying feeling of being truly, completely seen. The intellectual spark had been lit, and she knew with a certainty that both thrilled and horrified her that she would do anything to keep it from going out. The storm broke on Wednesday, a furious, theatrical downpour that seemed to wash the color from the world, leaving only shades of gray. Alara felt it was a fitting backdrop for the disquiet in her own soul. The intellectual high from her last session with Julian had faded into a low, persistent hum of something more dangerous, a feeling she refused to name. Walking to his office, the campus felt even more deserted, the rain driving everyone else indoors, creating a perfect, isolated stage for whatever was to come. She arrived soaked, her hair clinging to her cheeks, her simple jeans and sweater darkened with rain. When she opened the door, the familiar warmth and the scent of old books enveloped her, a stark contrast to the cold, wet world outside. Julian was standing by the window, looking out at the deluge. He turned as she entered, and the professional facade was gone entirely, replaced by a look of simple, undisguised warmth that made her heart skip a beat. "Alara," he said, his voice a low comfort against the drumming of the rain. "You look half drowned. Come in, get warm." He took her wet coat, his fingers brushing against hers in the exchange, a fleeting touch that was electric. He hung it on a hook behind the door and gestured again to the armchairs, which now felt like their designated space, a small island in his sea of books. But tonight, he didn't sit down immediately. He went to a low, unassuming wooden cabinet in the corner, a piece of furniture she had never paid much attention to before. He opened it, revealing a small collection of bottles and 2 elegant, long-stemmed wine glasses. "I think the weather calls for something to warm the blood, don't you?" he asked, his back still to her. "A California Merlot. Nothing fancy, but it gets the job done." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of intent. The clear, unspoken line between professor and student was about to be deliberately, irrevocably blurred. A part of her, the sensible part that sounded a lot like her boyfriend Liam, screamed that she should leave, that she should say no and run back out into the cleansing rain. But she was paralyzed, not by fear, but by a powerful, magnetic curiosity. She wanted to see what was on the other side of that line. Okay. She heard herself say the word a quiet surrender. He poured 2 glasses, the dark red liquid, a splash of vibrant color in the muted room. He handed one to her, his fingers once again grazing hers, and this time the touch lingered for a second longer. She took a sip, the wine rich and warm as it slid down her throat, a welcome heat spreading through her chest. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds, the relentless rain and the soft crackle of the old building settling around them. The pretense of academic discussion was gone. There was no book open between them tonight. "This isn't about John Donne anymore, is it?" she asked softly, looking into the swirl of her glass. He gave a small, sad smile. "I'm not sure it ever was, entirely." The conversation that followed was different from their last. It was more personal, more vulnerable. He asked about her dreams, not just for her career, but for her life. He listened with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world. He didn't just hear her words. He seemed to understand the fears and hopes hidden beneath them. In turn, emboldened by the wine and the strange intimacy of the storm-bound room, she asked about him. She asked about his wife, Isabel. "She's a brilliant woman," he said, his gaze drifting towards a silver-framed photograph on his desk that Alara had never noticed before. It showed Julian with a strikingly beautiful woman, both of them smiling, but not at each other. "Our lives run on parallel tracks. We admire each other from a distance." The loneliness in his voice was a raw, open thing, an unguarded confession that resonated with a similar loneliness deep inside her own heart. He turned his attention back to her, his eyes tracing the lines of her face in the soft lamplight. "You have a fire in you, Alara. Don't ever let anyone put it out. Not a job, not a man, not even yourself." And then the shift came. "The light, it catches in your hair," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It looks like spun gold." The compliment was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that it left her breathless. He wasn't talking to his student anymore. He was talking to a woman. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze dropping to her lips. "And your eyes. I've never seen a shade of green quite like that. They're honest, even when you're trying not to be." The space between their chairs seemed to vanish, the air growing thick and heavy. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint, intoxicating mix of old paper, wool, and wine. Her own breathing became shallow. This was it. This was the moment of decision, the precipice she had been walking towards since the first time she knocked on his door. He reached out, his hand moving with an agonizing slowness, and gently tucked a stray, damp strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm against her cold skin, and the touch, though feather-light, felt like a brand. His thumb stroked her cheek, a soft, questioning gesture, and then he leaned in. The first touch of his lips was tentative, almost shy, a soft pressure that asked a question. Her mind screamed, "No, stop, this is a mistake, think of Liam." For a second, her hands came up to press against the rough tweed of his jacket, a gesture of protest, but there was no strength in them. The taste of wine was on his lips, mingled with something that was uniquely him, something that was Julian. And as he felt her hesitate, he began to pull back, but it was too late. The dam of her resistance broke. The protest died in her throat, replaced by a soft, guttural sigh of surrender. Her hands, which had been pushing him away, now fisted in his jacket, pulling him back, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry, desperate, a release of all the tension that had been building between them for weeks. It was everything his academic analysis was not: raw, messy, and utterly, devastatingly real. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, staring at each other in the dim light, the sound of the rain filling the sudden, shocking silence. The line had been crossed, and in the wild, terrifying thrum of her own blood, Alara knew with absolute certainty that she never, ever wanted to go back. The silence that fell after the kiss was heavier and more profound than any sound. It was a vacuum, filled with the thunder of their own heartbeats and the relentless drumming of the rain, which seemed to mock the sudden stillness within the room. Alara stared at Julian, her lips still tingling, the taste of wine and a deep masculine musk still on her tongue. His face, usually a controlled mask of academic detachment, was stripped bare. She saw shock, a flicker of regret, and something else that terrified her, a raw, possessive hunger. It was a look that claimed her, that acknowledged the unspoken pact they had just sealed. She began, her voice a fractured thing. I have to go. He didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded, his own breathing ragged, his hand still resting on the arm of his chair as if to steady himself. Yes, he said, the word a gravelly admission of their shared transgression. You should. The departure was a clumsy, awkward ballet of averted gazes and fumbled movements. She grabbed her coat, the fabric still damp and cold, a shock against her heated skin. She didn't say goodnight. She didn't look back as she pulled the heavy office door shut, the click of the latch echoing in the empty hallway like a final, damning judgment. The walk back to her dorm was a blur. The rain had softened to a miserable drizzle, and the campus lights smeared across the wet pavement like watercolors. The world looked the same, but it was fundamentally altered because she was. Her mind was a war zone. One moment, she was reliving the kiss, the shocking, exquisite pressure of his mouth on hers, the feel of his hand on her cheek, the intoxicating feeling of being seen and desired so completely. It was a dizzying, exhilarating high, a potent drug that made the world feel more vibrant, more real. And in the next moment, an image of Liam would flash in her mind, his easy smile, his trusting eyes, the simple, uncomplicated love he offered her so freely. And with that image came a wave of guilt so profound it was physically nauseating. She felt hollowed out, a cheap imitation of the girl he thought he knew. She was a liar, a cheat. The words repeated in her head, a brutal mantra timed to the squelch of her boots on the pavement. By the time she reached the safety of her small dorm room, she felt fractured, a person split in two. Back in his office, Julian stood motionless for a long time, listening to her fading footsteps. He raised a hand to his lips, a gesture of disbelief. He could still feel her, the ghost of her warmth, the scent of her rain-damp hair. He sank back into his armchair, the leather groaning under his weight. A part of him, the disciplined, rational scholar, was appalled. He was her professor. He was a married man. He had crossed a line that was not meant to be a suggestion, but a fortress wall. It was the wine, he told himself. It was the storm, the late hour, the crushing weight of his own loneliness. A momentary lapse in an otherwise unimpeachable career. A single, regrettable mistake. But the other part of him, a part he had thought long dead, felt a powerful, undeniable surge of life. For the first time in years, he felt something other than the dull ache of intellectual fatigue and marital ennui. He felt alive. He felt wanted. The memory of her surrender, the way her initial resistance had melted into a desperate, clinging passion, was a fire in his blood. He knew, with a certainty, that both thrilled and terrified him, that he was already becoming obsessed with the need to feel it again. Alara had just peeled off her damp clothes and pulled on an old, oversized sweatshirt, Liam's sweatshirt, a cruel irony that twisted the knot in her stomach when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. His face, smiling and carefree, lit up the screen. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail, to hide, but that would only raise questions. She took a deep, shuddering breath and swiped to answer, composing her face into a mask of normalcy for a conversation he couldn't even see. Hey, you, his voice came through the speaker, warm and familiar and utterly devastating, just calling to say goodnight. How was the library? Did you slay the poetry dragon? She laughed, a sound so brittle and fake she hardly recognized it. Yeah, something like that. Just a lot of reading. You know how it is. Her room, usually her sanctuary, felt like a cage. Every object a photo of them on her desk, the worn sweatshirt she was wearing was an accusation. You sound tired, Elle, he said, a note of concern in his voice. Everything okay? No, nothing is okay. I just betrayed you in the most fundamental way. I just kissed my professor and I liked it, and the only thing I feel more than guilt is the desire to do it again. I'm fine, she said, her voice tight, just exhausted. It's been a long week. The lie came so easily, it scared her. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, a painful pantomime of their normal nightly ritual. Every I love you from him was a fresh stab of guilt. When she finally hung up, she collapsed onto her bed, burying her face in a pillow that smelled faintly of him, and let out a single, silent sob of self-loathing. Hours later, Julian drove home through the quiet, affluent suburban streets. He pulled into the driveway of his house, a modern architectural masterpiece of glass and steel. It was beautiful, sterile, and cold. Inside, the silence was absolute. The lights were on a timer, casting a gallery-like glow on the minimalist furniture and the expensive, abstract art that Isabel had chosen. There was no clutter, no sign of life, no warmth. It wasn't a home, it was a showroom. On the polished granite of the kitchen island, there was a note written in his wife's elegant, impersonal script. Flight to Chicago delayed. Back Friday, funds transferred for the caterer. There was no love, no XOXO, just information. It was a business memo, a perfect encapsulation of their marriage. He walked through the silent, empty rooms, the echo of his own footsteps, his only company. He saw their life for what it was, a polite, well-managed arrangement between two successful people who had nothing left to say to each other. In this cold, empty house, the memory of Alara's warmth, her passion, her vibrant life, felt like the only real thing he had touched in years. The guilt was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was being drowned out by a powerful, seductive rationalization. This wasn't a betrayal of his marriage. How can you betray something that is already dead? This was a desperate act of survival. And so, in their separate, silent worlds, surrounded by the ghosts of the lives they were supposed to be living, both Alara and Julian arrived at the same fragile conclusion. It was a mistake. A moment of madness brought on by circumstance. It was a secret to be buried, a memory to be forgotten. It would never happen again. It was a lie, they told themselves, with the desperate conviction of those who knew, deep in the marrow of their bones, that they were already waiting for the next storm. The days that followed were a masterclass in denial, a silent, torturous play acted out for an audience of no one. In the lecture hall, an invisible wall stood between them. Professor Croft never let his gaze linger on Alara's section of the room, his lectures on the passionate paradoxes of metaphysical poetry delivered with a new, brittle formality. Alara, for her part, kept her head down, her pen scratching furiously in her notebook, creating pages of notes she would never be able to decipher. She was acutely aware of him, of his presence at the front of the room, of the way his voice, which had whispered her name in the dark, now boomed with academic authority. The memory of the kiss was a physical presence, a third party in the room that only they could see. They were both clinging to the shared lie. It was a mistake. It will not happen again, but the lie was a flimsy raft in a rising tide of unspoken want. The tension was unsustainable, a string pulled so taut it had to either snap or be let go. Julian broke first. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a message so brief it was brutal. The subject line was empty. The body contained only 3 words. Can we talk? There was no signature, no salutation, none was needed. Below the question was the name of a place, the Griffin's Perch, and a time, 8 p.m. Alara knew the place by reputation only. It was a dark, old-world bar, several towns over, a place where people went when they did not want to be seen. This was not an invitation for academic counsel. It was a summons. It was a conscious, deliberate step out of the world of plausible deniability and into the shadows. She could have ignored it. She could have deleted the message and cemented the wall between them forever. That would have been the smart, safe, honorable thing to do. She stared at the screen for a long time, her heart a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. Then, she walked to her closet. The act of getting ready was a ritual of surrender. She was not dressing for a casual drink. She was arming herself for a foregone conclusion. She bypassed her usual uniform of jeans and sweaters and pulled out a dress she rarely wore. It was a simple black slip dress, cut on the bias so it clung to her curves without being overt, the fabric a soft whisper against her skin. It was elegant, but its simplicity was deceptive. Underneath, she chose a bra of deep burgundy lace, a secret indulgence, a silent promise. As she fastened the clasp, a sliver of the delicate lace was just visible above the dress's low neckline, a hint of color against her pale skin. It was a signal, a quiet confirmation that she was not coming to talk him out of this. She was coming to fall. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized, her eyes dark with a knowing resolve, her lips painted a soft, bruised red. The scared, guilty girl from the other night was gone, replaced by someone who had made a choice. The Griffin's perch was exactly as she'd imagined. Dark wood, low ceilings, and deep, secluded booths that offered anonymity. The air smelled of bourbon and old leather. She saw him in a corner booth, a solitary figure nursing a drink, looking utterly out of place in his professorial tweed jacket. He looked up as she approached, and the relief that washed over his face was so profound it stole her breath. He stood, a gesture of old-world chivalry that felt absurd given the circumstances. For a few minutes, they fell into the same awkward dance of avoidance, talking about the weather, the midterm exams, anything but the roaring fire between them. The waitress came, and Alara ordered a gin and tonic, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. When they were alone again, the silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Julian broke it, his voice low and raw. "I couldn't stay away," he said, not looking at her, but staring into the amber liquid of his glass. "I tried, Alara. I went back to being your professor. I went home to my life, but it was like trying to forget how to breathe." He finally lifted his eyes to hers, and they were filled with a desperate, aching honesty. "I can't stop thinking about you, about that night, about that kiss." There it was. The truth, laid bare on the sticky bar table between them. This was her final chance to run, to feign shock, to end it. Instead, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand over his on the table. His skin was warm. "Me too," she whispered, the admission a profound relief. "I've thought of nothing else." The rest of the conversation was a torrent, a flood of confessions. They spoke of their loneliness, of the lives they felt trapped in. He spoke of his cold, silent house, and she spoke of a loving but intellectually distant relationship with a boy who still saw her as the girl she used to be, not the woman she was becoming. They were two people confessing the same sin, the sin of wanting more. The air in the booth became suffocating, charged with a need that conversation could no longer contain. Julian threw a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover the drinks. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice thick. The car ride was completely silent, a stark contrast to the flood of words they had just unleashed. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and their own ragged breathing. He didn't drive towards the campus or towards his home. He drove up a winding road that led to a scenic lookout, a place that would be popular in the daytime but was now utterly deserted, the distant lights of the city a glittering tapestry below them. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He turned to her, and in the dim light from the dashboard, she saw a man consumed by a need so powerful it eclipsed everything else. "Alara," he began, but he couldn't finish. He didn't need to. She leaned across the console and met his lips with a ferocity that matched his own. This was not the tentative, questioning kiss from his office. This was a confirmation. It was hungry, impatient, a collision of mouths and bodies that had been denied for too long. His hands were in her hair, pulling her closer, while her hands fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, needing to feel the skin beneath. The confines of the car, which should have been awkward, only amplified their desperation. He pushed her gently back against the passenger seat, his body half covering hers, his knee pressing between her legs. "Julian, please," she gasped, the words a plea for him to stop and a prayer for him to never. His hand slid from her shoulder down the thin strap of her dress, his fingers finding the edge of the lace bra she had chosen just for him. He hooked a finger under the lace, pulling it aside, his touch a searing brand on her skin. The simple black dress was pushed up around her waist, a crumpled offering. They were a tangle of limbs and frantic, desperate breaths, the windows steaming up, cocooning them in their own private, illicit world. There was no more thought, no more rationalization, no more guilt. There was only this. A man and a woman at the point of no return, falling willingly, gratefully, into the beautiful, destructive heart of the fire. The secret life they built was not a spontaneous, frantic thing, but a meticulous, addictive ritual. It was an unspoken understanding forged in stolen glances across a crowded lecture hall and codified in brief, coded text messages sent from the privacy of separate worlds. A simple phrase like, "Have a question about Dawn's The Canonization," from Alara meant, "Can we meet? I need you." A response of "I'll be in my office until late" from Julian was his quiet, desperate acceptance. The thrill was no longer in the first, terrifying plunge, but in the delicious, slow-burning anticipation of the fall. The world outside their secret bubble was a series of tiresome obligations classes, a dutifully answered phone call with Liam, a silent, empty house that made the moments they spent together feel not just thrilling, but profoundly, desperately real. Julian's office became their sanctuary, a place where the rules of the world outside ceased to apply. It was more than just a room filled with books now. It was a stage for a story that only they would ever know. The single lamp cast a low, golden light that was almost theatrical, turning the mundane into the magical. The hum of the old radiator was a constant, comforting presence, and the scent of aged paper and Julian's specific, melancholic cologne became the scent of their own private world. Alara began to dress for these meetings with a meticulousness that was both a sin and a sacrament. She would go to a small lingerie shop downtown, picking out delicate lace and whisper-thin silk, pieces that were a complete secret under her everyday clothes. The act of putting them on in her small, sterile dorm room, knowing that only Julian would ever see them, was a powerful confirmation of her choice. She wore a deep red lace bodysuit one night, a sheer black chemise on another, each one a silent offering, a physical manifestation of her surrender. Their meetings were a slow, deliberate unwrapping of layers. It would begin with whispered conversation, sitting close in the armchairs, the academic pretext long abandoned. He would simply watch her, his blue eyes taking in every subtle detail, and she would feel his gaze, a physical warmth on her skin. He would talk about his day, the endless meetings and lectures, the quiet emptiness of his home, and she would tell him about her classes, her friends, her small victories and failures. And then, without a word, one of them would break the intellectual spell, reaching out to close the last few inches of distance between them. The passion was not a frantic, panicked thing like their second encounter. It had become a slow, masterful burn, a deep-seated craving that they both savored. He would take her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and kiss her palm, his lips warm and soft. He would trace the line of her jaw with his thumb before a kiss, his eyes holding hers in a promise of what was to come. Their kisses were long, languid explorations, a deep, silent communication that spoke volumes. The scent of wine on her lips, the taste of his mouth, these were now the flavors of her secret life. When he finally led her to the floor, where they would lay among discarded books and papers, the climax was not a destination but a journey. The physical intimacy was a revelation. With a practiced tenderness that belied his academic persona, he would peel away her clothes, the soft wool of her sweater, the familiar denim of her jeans, and then the reveal, the delicate lace she had chosen just for him. His breath would catch in his throat, a soft, appreciative sound. "God, Alara," he would whisper, his voice rough with a deep, consuming desire. "You're beautiful." He would trace the outline of the black lace, his fingers feather-light against her skin. He would hold her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, before his lips would find the plump fullness of her breasts, his tongue swirling around the sensitive peaks. Alara's body would arch in a silent, desperate prayer of pleasure, her hands fisting in his dark hair. A soft cry would escape her lips. "Julian, ah, yes, right there." Her voice would be a breathless, unfamiliar sound of pure ecstasy. He would kiss her lips, her neck, the line of her collarbone, his body a heavy, welcome weight against hers. Her hands would slide under his buttoned-up shirt, feeling the solid warmth of his skin, the muscular contours of his chest and arms, the reality of him. "You feel incredible," he would whisper against her skin, his body trembling with the need she had awakened in him. So soft, so perfect. The sounds of their intimacy were as much a part of the ritual as the touches. The rustle of clothes on the floor, the soft slap of skin against skin, the low, guttural moans from him, her whispered words of encouragement and pleasure. Their breaths were ragged, a shared rhythm in the silent office. There was no shame, only an all-consuming sense of rightness, as if this was what their bodies had been designed for. Afterward, they would lie entwined on the floor, the remnants of their clothes, a soft nest around them, the silence now a deep, shared contentment. He would trace patterns on her skin, and she would listen to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her ear. It was a peace she never knew existed, a stillness that made the outside world seem like a noisy, irrelevant dream. But the dream always ended. A faint sound from the hallway, a door closing somewhere down the hall, or the sudden, jarring flash of a text message from his wife, a reminder of the two separate public lives they had to return to. The thrill of the secret was intoxicating, but the constant, low-grade fear of discovery was its bitter aftertaste. And yet, this fear, this knowledge that every stolen moment was a dance on the edge of a precipice, only made the wanting more potent, more desperate, and infinitely more addictive. The physical passion, a fire that had consumed them both, was no longer the primary reason for their meetings. It had become a preamble, a feverish consummation of the week's built-up longing, but it was the hours that followed that truly defined their secret world. They would lie together on the floor of his office, or sit on the worn couch in his home, talking until the moon hung low in the sky. Their conversations had gone from the academic to the intimate, from the intimate to the profoundly, dangerously personal. It was in these quiet hours, wrapped in a comfortable silence or sharing the most vulnerable parts of themselves, that the lines between lust and love began to blur and then dissolve completely. For Alara, it was not just Julian's body she craved, but the man behind it. He was a universe of knowledge and wit, and he had unlocked a part of her mind she never knew existed. He remembered every detail she told him, every fleeting thought, every small anecdote about her family or her childhood dreams. He would weave these details into their conversations days, even weeks later, a casual confirmation that he had truly been listening, truly been seeing her. He didn't just tell her she was brilliant, he proved it by challenging her to think in ways she never had, by engaging with her mind as an equal. The intensity of his attention was a drug more potent than any physical thrill. She began to measure her worth not by her grades, but by the way his eyes would light up when she said something clever. He was her mentor, her confidant, her lover, and in the breathless, heady chaos of it all, she began to mistake the intensity of the secret for the profound reality of true love. The easy, comfortable affection she had for Liam now felt like a pale, tepid thing. His nightly calls, once a source of comfort, became a duty. She would lie in her bed, listening to him talk about his friends, his classes, his mundane life, and her mind would be a million miles away, replaying a moment in Julian's office, a shared smile, a whispered confession. The guilt was still a low, persistent ache, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful sense of having found her real life, a life that only existed with Julian. Julian, in turn, had become possessive. The loneliness of his life had been a heavy, suffocating blanket, and Alara was a sudden, violent injection of color and light. She was not just a beautiful young woman, she was a life force, a fountain of youth and unburdened passion that he had thought lost forever. He needed her to breathe, to feel something other than the quiet, dignified despair of his marriage. He began to subtly probe into her social life, asking who her friends were, who she spent her weekends with. He would become quiet, his jaw tight, at the mention of her time with Liam, a jealousy he was too proud to fully admit but too desperate to hide. She was his secret, and the idea of her existing in a world he couldn't see, with people who held a claim on her time and affection, was unbearable. She had made his cold world warm, and he was terrified of her leaving. She was his last chance, and he was clinging to her with a ferocious desperation. And then, one night, after a physical passion so profound it left them both breathless and drained, Julian spoke the unthinkable aloud. They were lying tangled on the plush rug of his office, the only light from the city below casting a faint, silver glow on the room. "Sometimes," he whispered, his voice rough against her hair, "I think of just leaving." Alara's breath hitched. She knew what he meant. He meant leaving Isabel, leaving the sterile house, leaving the life he had built. He began to paint a picture, a fantasy so vivid and so beautiful it felt real enough to touch. "We could go somewhere else," he said, his voice full of a desperate hope. "I could get a position at a smaller college, out west maybe. We could have a little house with a garden, and I could teach what I love. And you could write. We could just be free." He spoke of a life that was both impossible and everything she had ever dreamed of. A life built on a foundation of betrayal and lies, but a life that felt infinitely more real than the one she was living. She closed her eyes, letting the beautiful lie wash over her, a warm, numbing wave. She imagined a home with him, a life where she was not a secret but a constant, a life where her intellect and her body were both treasured. She knew, in the dark, honest recesses of her mind, that this was a shared delusion. They were not planning a future, they were fantasizing about an escape, a way out of the prison of their own making. But they couldn't stop. They built their little cottage by the sea, filled it with books and music and whispered words, a fragile, impossible kingdom of two, knowing all the while that the walls of their real lives were still standing and were now higher and stronger than ever before. The emotional entanglement was complete. The affair was no longer a guilty pleasure, it was a devastating necessity. The joy of their time together was now laced with an equal part of dread, the dread of returning to a world that felt cold and foreign, the dread of discovery, and the worst dread of all, the dread that this fantasy, this fragile, beautiful kingdom of two, was built on nothing but a lie that would one day crumble and leave them with nothing but the dust of what might have been. The thrill of the secret was still there, but now it was a heavy, suffocating thing, a beautiful cage that both protected them and held them captive. For weeks, the affair was a beautiful, intoxicating bubble, a world of two that seemed impenetrable to the mundane realities outside. Their stolen moments had become so routine that they had begun to feel safe in them, even reckless. They no longer limited their meetings to the fortress of Julian's office. They would slip into empty lecture halls after hours, or find a quiet, forgotten corner of the library stacks, where the scent of old paper and the hushed silence made for a perfect backdrop to their quiet transgressions. It was in one of these clandestine spots, tucked away in the philosophy section, that the bubble finally burst. Julian had her pinned gently against a bookshelf, his body a warm weight against hers, his lips moving from her mouth to the hollow of her throat. The scent of his cologne, the rough tweed of his jacket against her hands, the familiar feeling of her own body melting into his. It was a routine now, a beautiful, familiar dance that had become as natural as breathing. And then, a sound, a key turning in a lock down the hall, followed by the soft click of a door and the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone coming their way. The sound was so jarring, so completely foreign to the world they had created, that it was like a bucket of cold water. In an instant, the passionate embrace shattered. They pulled apart, a violent, panicked separation. Julian grabbed her arm, his grip tight, pulling her back further into the shadows between the shelves. The blood had drained from his face, and his eyes, which had been so full of tender desire a second ago, were now wide with a raw, animal fear. Alara's heart slammed against her ribs, a wild, terrified drum. She could hear the person's footsteps, getting closer, the muffled sound of a cart being wheeled along the polished floor. It was a janitor, a late-night cleaner making their rounds. They stood there, utterly still, holding their breath, a pair of thieves caught in the beam of a flashlight that hadn't even found them yet. The footsteps paused just outside their aisle. Alara felt a wave of nausea, her mind racing with 100 different lies, 100 different ways this would end. The shame, the humiliation, the look on Liam's face. The person hummed a tuneless melody, adjusted something on their cart, and then the sound of the wheels continued, slowly fading away down the long corridor. The silence that returned was deafening. They stayed frozen for another long moment, the air thick with the aftershocks of their panic. Julian was the first to move. He let go of her arm, his hand falling to his side, but his body was still coiled, still ready for flight. Alara could feel the sweat on her palms, the clamminess of her skin. The passion was gone, utterly and completely, replaced by a cold, bitter terror. She saw him not as her lover, but as a conspirator, a co-conspirator in a crime that was about to be exposed. The library, their sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The books around them were no longer a source of beauty and intellectual wonder, but a flimsy, useless barrier. He took a single, unsteady step back from her, and in that small movement, she felt a profound shift. The carefree thrill of their secret life had vanished, leaving behind only the raw, ugly reality of what they were doing. This was not a romance. This was a lie. She made her excuses quickly, her voice thin and shaky. "I need to go. I need to get out of here." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, his eyes still wide with fear. a man haunted by a ghost he had just narrowly avoided. She walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall, a sound that was no longer an announcement of her freedom but a desperate flight from what had just happened. She was still shaking when she got back to her dorm, the cold air offering no comfort to the terror that had taken root in her bones. She sank onto her bed, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to still the frantic beating of her heart. The world outside, the world with Liam, suddenly felt like the safest, most precious thing she had ever known. She had been playing with fire, and now, for the first time, she had felt its scorching heat. Just as the cold wave of fear was beginning to subside, her phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a video call from Liam. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to throw the phone across the room, to make this day vanish into a black hole of forgetfulness. But she knew she couldn't. With a deep, shuddering breath, she swiped to answer, forcing a smile onto her trembling lips. His face appeared on the screen, a beacon of normalcy and innocent, trusting love that felt like a punch to the gut. He was smiling, excited. "Hey, babe, guess what?" His voice was bright, full of an uncomplicated joy that she now felt utterly unworthy of. "My boss gave me a few days off. I booked a flight. I'm coming to see you this weekend." The words, meant as a surprise, landed like a catastrophic bomb. Her blood ran cold. The distance between them, which had been a protective shield, was about to vanish. The two separate, irreconcilable worlds she had built were about to collide in a spectacular, inevitable crash. She stared at him, her forced smile, a grotesque, painful thing on her face. "Liam, that's great." The lie felt like ash on her tongue. She sent Julian a single text message minutes later, the words blurring through her panicked tears. "Liam is coming. This weekend." She put her phone down, the screen dark, and waited. The reply came almost immediately. "When is he leaving?" The question was cold, clinical, devoid of the concern or passion she had grown so accustomed to. He didn't ask if she was okay, didn't offer a word of comfort. His possessiveness, now stripped bare of its romantic veneer, was exposed as what it really was, a selfish fear of losing his toy. The terror of being discovered, which had started in the library, now had a face, Liam's kind, trusting face. And it had an end date, this weekend. The carefree innocence of the affair was gone forever. It was a game now, and they were playing it with a gun to their heads. Every shadow, every sound, every moment apart was a new source of dread. The beautiful, secret world had cracked, and the bitter wind of reality was beginning to rush in. The week of Liam's visit was a masterclass in performance. Alara smiled, she laughed. She held his hand as they walked across the campus he so loved. Every interaction was a lie. Her mind was a constant loop of panic, one eye always on her phone, waiting for a text from Julian, the other on Liam, her beloved, who was so completely and blissfully unaware. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the joy that should have been present replaced by a profound, suffocating dread. The emotional high of the affair had been replaced by a slow-burning anxiety that consumed her from the inside out. Julian, for his part, was a ghost, his texts clipped and cold, his responses more like commands than conversation. He would ask only about Liam's departure date, his possessiveness now stripped bare of its romantic pretense and exposed for what it was, a selfish fear of losing his toy. It was a hellish week, a living nightmare built on a foundation of betrayal. On Saturday afternoon, a rare, beautiful day of crisp autumn sun, Liam suggested they take a walk down to the campus's main quad, a large grassy area surrounded by the grand, old academic buildings. Alara agreed, her smile strained, her heart pounding a familiar rhythm of fear. As they walked, her hand in his, a quiet, simple moment of intimacy that now felt like a borrowed ritual, she saw them. They were walking out of the humanities building, the very building that housed Julian's office, and for a moment, her mind simply could not process it. It was Julian, dressed not in his professorial tweed, but in a smart navy blazer, looking impossibly handsome and put together in the sunlight. And beside him was a woman. The woman, Isabel. Alara froze. Liam, a few steps ahead, turned back to her. "Everything okay, babe?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. She simply shook her head, unable to form words. The world around her had gone silent. The gentle chatter of students, the distant peal of a bell, all fading into an unreality. All that existed was the two of them, a tableau of a life she had only ever seen in a photograph. Julian's wife was not the cold, distant figure she had conjured in her mind to justify her actions. She was a vision. Isabel was tall and elegant, dressed in a simple but impossibly chic cream-colored coat. Her posture was straight. Her dark hair was swept back from a face that was not just beautiful, but intelligent and confident. She was not a cold footnote. She was a presence. She was grace and poise, and an effortless sophistication that Alara, in her simple student clothes and her tangled web of lies, knew she could never possess. They were talking, a small smile on Julian's face as he listened to something she was saying. She reached up and, with a casual intimacy that made Alara's stomach churn, brushed a piece of lint from his lapel. It was a gesture of a woman who knew she belonged to him, and he to her. In that single, fleeting motion, Alara's entire fantasy crumbled. The love story she had so carefully constructed, the one where she was his emotional savior, the one where his marriage was an empty shell and she was the brilliant, vibrant young woman who had finally awoken his heart, it was all exposed as a pathetic, childish lie. She was not his escape. She was just a secret. She was a passing distraction, a fleeting, selfish pleasure, and Isabel was his reality. She was a part of his world, a world of beautiful, successful people who moved with an easy confidence she could never fake. The wave of guilt, which had been a low, persistent ache, now crashed over her with a devastating force. She was not a heroine. She was the other woman. She was the girl who was actively participating in the quiet, ugly betrayal of a woman she now saw as a tangible, real person. The shame was immense, a hot, searing brand on her soul. The fantasy of a life together, of the little cottage by the sea, of their shared love of poetry, it was a sick, pathetic delusion she had indulged in to justify her own selfish desires. The price of her ambition, of her extra credit, was not a grade, but her very soul. As if he could feel her gaze, Julian's head turned slightly. His eyes, sweeping over the crowd, caught hers for a single, devastating second. The flash of recognition in his eyes was instant, followed by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. His smile vanished. He turned back to Isabel, his movements stiff and abrupt, as he took her arm and began to guide her away, a sudden forced conversation bubbling from his lips. He had seen her, and he had seen the reality of his two worlds coming dangerously close to a collision. For a brief, terrifying moment, the lie he was living had been laid bare for him to see, and the fear in his eyes was not of being caught, but of losing the carefully curated, beautiful life he had built with his wife. He was not a man who was trapped. He was a man who had everything, and was willing to risk it all for a fleeting, selfish pleasure. The two of them walked on, a perfect, polished couple, leaving Alara standing on the grass with a kind and gentle boy who held her hand, a boy whose trust she was shattering. The bitter wind of reality had blown away every beautiful delusion, leaving her with the cold, hard wreckage of her own choices. The affair had started with a need for a grade, and it had blossomed into a fantasy of love. But here, in this moment, looking at the truth in the beautiful, confident face of the woman she had betrayed, she finally understood the real cost. It was not a matter of passing or failing a class. It was a matter of passing or failing as a human being, and in that moment she knew she had failed. The window for their secret was closing, a final, cold snap of the world's reality. Liam was scheduled to fly out the next morning, and Isabel had sent an email to Julian about a shared professional dinner they were to attend later in the week. The two separate, irreconcilable lives they had so carefully kept apart were now closing in on them, leaving no room for their fragile, beautiful lie. The panic that had consumed Alara during Liam's visit had faded into a deep, hollow exhaustion. She felt like she had been holding her breath for days. The texts between her and Julian were different now, stripped of the playful subtext and the breathless desire. They were short, somber, and to the point. The final meeting was set not with the thrilling anticipation of a secret rendezvous, but with the grim resignation of a necessary farewell. The rain had returned, but this time it was not a furious downpour of passion. It was a cold, unforgiving drizzle, a fitting mirror for their mood. Alara walked into Julian's office, their sanctuary, and found it utterly transformed. The soft, golden light seemed dimmer, The familiar scent of old books felt like the smell of a tomb. Julian was standing by the window, his back to her, a ghost in his own space. He did not turn to greet her with a kiss or a touch. The air between them was thick with all the things they couldn't say, all the impending grief they were about to share. He finally turned, and his face was drawn, tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she had ever seen them. There were no more lies to tell, no more fantasies to build. Only this raw, painful finality. "I need you to tell me," she said, her voice a small, fragile thing. "What are we doing?" She was not asking for a rationalization. She was asking for a shared acknowledgement of the self-destruction. He took a single, slow step towards her, his eyes holding hers in a profound, mournful gaze. "I don't know, Alara," he said, the words a low, pained admission. "I just know I don't want to lose this." He didn't say her name, didn't have to. This was everything they had been to each other. The desperate passion, the quiet moments of connection, the impossible fantasy of a life together, the escape from their cold realities. She took a shuddering breath, the air in her chest tight with a powerful sense of grief. "I saw you," she said, her voice breaking, "with your wife. She's beautiful, Julian. She's real." The words hung in the air, a final, damning truth she had forced them both to confront. The fantasy of Isabel as a passive, distant figure was gone forever. He closed his eyes for a moment, a gesture of profound pain. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She is." He was not making an excuse for his betrayal. He was confessing it. "The life I have, it's beautiful, a perfect, respectable lie, and for a moment, you made me feel something real." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a profound sorrow. He reached out and gently placed his hands on her shoulders, the simple touch a painful weight. "I told myself I was rescuing you, that I was giving you the passion your young life deserved. But I was the one who was drowning. You were the only one who could save me." His confession was not an act of love, but an act of brutal, honest desperation. She was not the brilliant young woman he was saving. She was the life raft he was clinging to. The fantasy had always been his, and she had just been a willing accomplice. The physical encounter that followed was not a passionate embrace, but a desperate, sorrowful act of farewell. They clung to each other, their bodies seeking a final, impossible comfort. The kisses were no longer hungry. They were filled with the taste of loss and regret. He buried his face in her neck, his body shaking with a low, silent sob. Her fingers fisted in his shirt, not in passion, but in a heartbreaking, desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already gone. They made love with a mournful, painful resignation, each touch a goodbye, each kiss a silent elegy. There was no exhilaration, no frantic pleasure. There was only a deep, aching sadness. The words they exchanged were not of pleasure, but of grief. "Oh God, Julian," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "What have we done?" He didn't answer her with words, only with a kiss, a final, sorrowful press of his lips that was both a confession and an apology. Afterward, they simply lay together on the floor for a long, quiet time, their clothes a tangled mess around them, the rain a soft, persistent funeral song. There was nothing left to say. There was no future to plan, no lies left to tell. The lie itself was the only thing that had kept them alive, and now that it was gone, there was only the cold reality of the end. Alara was the first to move, pulling herself away from him, the chill of the office air, a shocking, painful contrast to the warmth of his body. She dressed in a fog, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind a blank slate of utter despair. Julian simply watched her, his face a silent mask of defeat. He was not the confident, brilliant professor she had fallen for. He was just a lonely, broken man, watching his one moment of fleeting happiness walk out the door. She reached the door, her hand on the cold brass knob. She turned back one last time. He was still standing there, a solitary, mournful figure in the dim light. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the man she had loved, but the man whose life she had shattered and who had shattered hers in return. There was no last word, no final declaration, only a single, shared look of profound loss. She turned the knob and walked out into the cold, drizzling night, the door clicking shut behind her with the sound of a final judgment. The affair was over, but it had not left her. It had hollowed her out, leaving behind a profound, aching emptiness that was more painful than any feeling she had ever known. She had started the semester desperate to save her future. She had earned her grade, but she had lost her soul. The semester ended as all things must, not with a bang, but with a quiet, somber sigh. The final paper was submitted, and the emails containing the final grades were sent out. Ilara opened hers in her dorm room, alone, the screen a stark white against the gray afternoon. It was a single, perfect character, an A, the grade she had risked everything for. The grade that Julian Croft had promised to help her earn. She looked at it, and there was no sense of triumph, no rush of relief, only a profound, aching hollowness. The victory felt like a loss, the win a final, damning confirmation of a game she had played and won in the most dishonest way imaginable. She saw Julian for the last time in the final lecture. He stood at the front of the room, impeccably dressed, a pillar of academic authority. He never once looked her way. The secret was over. The need was gone, and in the space of a single week, they had faded back into strangers, leaving only a ghost of what had been between them. She went home for the holidays, and the cheerful, loving normalcy of her family's life felt like a foreign country. Liam was there, his love, an honest, simple thing she felt utterly unworthy of. Every smile, every touch, every word of his was a fresh stab of guilt. The lie she had been living was now a physical presence between them, a wall she couldn't see but could feel with every passing moment. One evening, after her family had gone to bed, they were sitting in her old living room, the fire crackling and the scent of pine filling the air. He was talking about their future, a simple, beautiful future of his making, and as she looked at his kind, trusting face, she felt a profound, heartbreaking realization. She could not be the person he loved anymore. The girl she was when he fell for her was gone, consumed by a secret she could never tell. She broke it off gently, her voice thick with tears she couldn't explain, her words a quiet admission of a betrayal she could not name. He was confused, heartbroken, but he was also decent. He didn't fight, he just left, leaving her alone in the silent, cold house with the weight of her choices, a cold stone in her gut. The end of their relationship was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, sorrowful consequence of a lie that had become too heavy to bear. Years passed. Ilara became a woman of her own making, moving to a city, finding a job, building a life that was outwardly a success. But the ghost of the affair was always there, a low hum beneath the surface of her life. It would surface in a flash, an unexpected jolt of memory. The scent of a particular cologne, the look of rain on a window, the sound of a certain classical piece of music, and with it came the question that she knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had succeeded. She had kept her scholarship. She had a good career. She had passed the class with a perfect grade. But did she earn that A? Was her success a product of her own talent and hard work? Or was it a direct consequence of a compromise she had made, a moral line she had crossed? She would never know. The ambiguity was the real price. The affair wasn't just a secret, it was a psychological scar, a permanent stain on her soul that made her question her own worth, her own talent, her own fundamental goodness. It was not a grand tragedy, but a quiet, personal corruption. The price of passing was losing the one thing she could never get back, her innocence. And Julian remained. The years passed and they passed over him, leaving him a little older, a little more weathered, but fundamentally the same. The old New England campus remained his world, his office a silent testament to a life that had long since settled into an orderly, passionless routine. He would sit in his chair on a late autumn afternoon, the dim light catching the dust motes in the air, and he would remember. He would remember a young girl with a fire in her eyes, a girl who made him feel, for a brief, glorious period of time, that he was more than just a respectable scholar. He would look out his window at the students walking below, their lives a vibrant tapestry of possibility, and he would see them, a blur of youth and ambition. Perhaps his eyes would linger for a moment on a young woman with a certain shade of hair, or a certain purposeful stride. He would simply sigh, a sound of profound, weary resignation. He had his life, a life of honor and success and comfort, But he was a man condemned to his quiet, orderly existence, forever haunted by the brief, brilliant chaos he had dared to pursue. He had traded his fleeting, forbidden happiness for the empty security of his marriage, and in doing so, he had become a ghost in his own life, a man who had everything and nothing, forever longing for a love that had never truly been his to begin with.